We are crucifying our poor people on a cross of gold. He was advocating for silver. The people in the convention rose up and cheered, and they quickly nominated Bryan to be their candidate. Bryan was the youngest candidate ever nominated at that time, and maybe the youngest one ever nominated by a major party. William Jennings Bryan was only in his mid-30s. But he, having gotten a nomination of his party, William McKinley, when he heard the news, said, this man's going to be easy to beat. Now, William McKinley had a wife who was an invalid, cripple, and he did not want to leave her. So he said, I'm going to conduct my campaign from my front porch. So he conducted what he called a front porch campaign, where he received guests and gave them instructions how to conduct a campaign while he stayed home, believing he had an easy win. But William Jennings Bryan went all over the country, talking loudly, stopping at every railroad stop, rallying the common people. What was Mrs. McKinley's problem, by the way? I mean, Mrs. McKinley, some people believe it was purely psychological. She believed that God was punishing her and her husband for their sins, either her or her husband or both. She might not have had anything wrong with her other than mental. But anyway, she became completely invalid, unable to walk, unable to function as a normal human. William McKinley remained loyal to her anyway. Well, finally, though, the people around McKinley said, you'd better get out and campaign. Bryan is fast catching up to you. Now, there were no polls in those days. So Bryan finally got out at the last minute and campaigned and began to convince the people that he was for the common man also. The election was close, one of the closest in history, but when it was over with, William McKinley had won. William Jennings Bryan was to run for president 2 more times and lose all times. He never became president. Maybe he shouldn't have. Oh yes, the Populist Party, in the meantime, they met in their convention for the second time. They put out, instead of putting out their own candidate, whom they knew could not win, they said, let's nominate Bryan. So the Populists also nominated Bryan. So Bryan was head not only of the Democrat, but the Populist Party also. When Bryan was defeated, the Populist Party was dead. But a lot of its things that it stood for lived on, and eventually became the law in most states, if not the law of the land. Again, this we don't need, probably never did need, but they didn't know it at the time. The rest of these, some of them are still on the books we don't care about. This we do care about. This is still on the books. Direct election of senators. All right. Now, William McKinley, I do feel somewhat of an affinity for him. He's the only, I am not related to him, but one of my first cousins is, on her mother's side, not on the same side, not on her father's mother's side. Okay, on the side that I'm not related to. Her father's mother's maiden name was McKinley, and she was related to William McKinley. So that's the nearest I've come to being related to a president. But anyway, William McKinley took office in 1897. Now, he has been called the first modern president. Here in Atlanta, we have a presidential library. I haven't been there in years, but the 2 times I went, Jimmy Carter starts his listing of the presidents with William McKinley, owing to the fact that William McKinley was the president in 1900, and he started 1900. But William McKinley has been called the first modern president in that he broke away from George Washington and got the United States heavily involved in world affairs, more so than any president before him. But also, he would visit people who were stricken, like if an earthquake struck, he'd get on a train and he'd visit these people and console them. And he would visit people who were stricken by tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever. He would try to visit them. And our presidents from that day to this have followed him, his advice. He was the first president to do that. Again, he got us involved in a war with another country. Now, the United States had run out of borders to expand to. I mean, the United States had pursued an expansionist policy, expand. And I've seen many a map of how the United States started out with 13 colonies and then got more states, went farther westward. Eventually we got the 48 states that we have today, the lower 48 they're called. But a lot of persons want us to expand outside those borders. And the Spanish-American War gave us that chance. We had had our eye on two places for a long time, Cuba and Hawaii. Why was Hawaii important? Simply this: Hawaii is smack almost in the middle of the great Pacific Ocean. The trip by ship, in those days there were no planes, but the trip by ship from California to the Far East was 10,000 miles, and a lot of ships needed to load up on more food and fuel and water and drinking water, that is, more supplies. So we just felt like we'd like to have Hawaii as a base of operations so that we can have our crews refuel there. You know, basically we wanted to own Hawaii. As for Cuba, we'd had our sights set on Cuba for a long time. Before we got either one though, your book talks about China. In China, Christian missionaries from both Europe and the United States went in there to try to convert the Chinese. The Chinese strongly resisted. They always have. I mean, the first Christian missionaries are known to have arrived in China in 100 AD. In other words, 30 years after Christ left the earth. 70 years after Christ left the earth. The Chinese have always resisted foreign religions. They like two religions of their own, Confucianism and Taoism. But they did not embrace Buddhism very strongly. They did not embrace Christianity. They did not embrace the Japanese religion of Shinto, because they believed that they were better than everybody else, and they would have believed this for the longest of time, and maybe to some extent still do. But anyway, the Chinese resisted, but ironically, in 1949, they embraced a foreign worldview, namely communism. But leaving that, a bunch of young boys, young men in China got together and formed what's called the Fist of Righteousness, otherwise known as Boxers, and their goal was to drive the foreigners out. They killed a few missionaries and hold up a few other ambassadors. So the nations involved, including, well, not the United States, but Britain and France, sent an army into China and crushed the Boxer Rebellion. Then our American Secretary of State, John Hay by name. Now, John Hay proposed that China, we have an open door policy in China where anybody who wanted to could trade with China. And this policy was finally adopted by the nations involved. Russia, let's see, there was Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States, and I believe Japan, 5 nations that were heavily involved. And they forced China into an open door policy, greatly against the Chinese will. All this was to create tensions between China and the rest of the world that still last to this day. All right, now, in the meantime, south of Florida in Cuba. Cuba had not gotten their independence from Spain when the rest of the Latin America did, so Cuba was still controlled by Spain. In the 1890s, Cuba revolted. The Spanish moved in to crush the revolt, and the Spanish treated the Cubans with utmost cruelty. A lot of Americans said we ought to get involved and help, because the Monroe Doctrine told the foreign countries they were not to intervene and interfere in the West. That we ought to help the rebels in Cuba, because we, after all, had received help when we fought against Great Britain. That was the logic used. Well, in the meantime, we sent a ship. We sent a big ship. Warship to Havana. While the Maine was sitting in Havana Harbor, it blew up, boom, and sunk to the bottom. We have since sent divers down there to look for it. I mean, it's still there, unrecoverable. But anyway, now, the war cry went up, remember the Maine and down with Spain. Spain was accused of setting the bombs that blew the Maine up. Now today, we don't think so. We sent a team of engineers to investigate, And they said that it looked like bombs had destroyed the Maine, but we know something today that they did not know. You put a bunch of coal, tons of coal, in one location. The weight of this coal can build up a lot of heat, and the coal can explode, or said it's called spontaneous combustion. It can explode by itself. Ask any farmer, and they'll tell you they're careful not to put wheat in their barns when the wheat is wet. Wheat sitting in an open field can just all by itself combust, even though that's not like, but you put a bunch of wheat, especially if some of it's wet, and that means it's going to weigh a whole lot more. As this wheat dries out, there'll still be some wet on top of it. And eventually the wheat will get so hot it will start combusting by itself, or spontaneous combustion. We now believe that the coal, the Maine was coal burner, was a coal burner. We now believe the coal on board the Maine combusted itself. Anyway, Spain was accused, with no real justification, but Spain was accused of blowing up our ship. War was declared against Spain. The war occurred on two fronts, the Philippines and in Cuba. President William McKinley, when asked to order that our commander in the Philippines moved against the Spanish Navy in the Philippines, William McKinley turned to him and said, "Can you please tell me, where are the Philippines?" He didn't know, and at that time most Americans didn't either. We don't see this much today, but even when I was a kid, a lot of Americans were ignorant of geography, thanks to a famous educator named Dewey who said geography should not be taught. It was irrelevant. Today, we feel otherwise, and geography is being taught again, but for many years geography was relegated to back seat in learning. And but anyway, we made a move against the Spanish in the Philippines. We also got together an army and invaded Cuba. The army was led by an upcoming man named Theodore Roosevelt. He got together a group called the Rough Riders. These were cavalrymen. Now, the Rough Riders landed on Cuba, and they charged up a hill called San Juan Hill. The hill was 40 degrees in an angle, pretty steep. But the Spanish were not ready to fight Americans. It was one thing they could fight these Cubans, but they could not fight an American army. Now, I'll never forget, though, what one of my 8th grade teachers said about the Rough Riders. She said, "The Battle of San Juan Hill was nothing more than a bunch of grown men playing cowboys and Indians, except they were using real horses and real guns." That was somewhat of a cynical attitude, but nevertheless, this is how she felt about it. That the Spanish-American War to her was not the least bit necessary. It might have done us more harm than good. But anyway, we took Cuba from Spain, and then if that weren't enough, Commander Dewey made some famous words to the person next to him. He said, "You may fire when ready." So that person fired against the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. That battle was easily won. To make a long story short, Spain was not ready to fight the United States. In short order, Spain sat down with their ambassadors. We sat down with ours. We agreed to pay Spain, I believe, something like $20 million, maybe $10 million, but millions of dollars. And in turn, Spain gave us Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and I believe Samoa, a whole bunch of places. Not Samoa, but Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, we got those places. Well, it wasn't that simple. Now, in the case of Puerto Rico is willing to become a United States outpost, so we have Puerto Rico to this day. And Puerto Rico has become a serious liability. Even before the big hurricane hit them, just a couple years back, they were having severe economic problems. So, and the United States has not bailed them out. So they're still having severe economic, and a lot of the people are leaving Puerto Rico and coming to the United States, leaving in droves. As for Cuba Cuba said, we don't want to become a part of the United States, so we wound up giving Cuba their independence with a couple of stipulations. One stipulation was that we said we want a base in Guantanamo Bay, which we still have. So we have a base in Guantanamo Bay to this day. We never did give it up, even though we signed a 99-year lease on it. The 99 years have expired. We never gave it up. But the Philippines is really one of the worst cases scenarios. We insisted that the Filipinos were not ready for independence. So, the same man who had helped us, had encouraged us to come into the Philippines, and he had looked on us as being liberators, now this same man turned on us as an enemy. The United States sent an army. We lost 4,000 men fighting in the Philippines. 10 times what we lost in Cuba. We lost about 40 men in Cuba. 4,000 men in 100 times more. 4,000 men in the Philippines. And in addition, the Filipinos lost 25,000 men fighting us. The war was extremely cruel and bloody. All right, here's the point I'm making, folk. The very thing we went to war to stop, we wound up doing ourselves. I do have permission, my sisters, to tell this. They're both still around. When I was 18 years old, my two youngest sisters got in a fight. Their ages were 10 and 8. The 10-year-old was beating up on the 8-year-old pretty good, and I didn't think that was fair, so I thought I'd intervene on behalf of the 8-year-old. First, the 10-year-old girl started pounding on me, then the 8-year-old joined in, and before I knew, both of the girls were pounding on me. It actually happened. And I remember thinking, hey, in my history lesson, see, I was in college now, in my history lesson, maybe this is what's wrong with the United States and its intervention and where it doesn't belong. If we'd have left the Filipinos alone, they'd have started fighting among themselves. Well, eventually we did leave them alone. But we insisted, no, you people are just like the Cubans, you're not ready for democracy. Let us educate you and let us train you, let us clean you up and get you ready for democracy. Now, in the meantime, foreign countries, particularly Britain and France. All right, Britain, France, and Russia had spent the 1800s building an empire. France had conquered Algeria. France had conquered much of the Sahara. Great Britain had conquered much of the Middle East. France had conquered Indochina, or today Vietnam. Britain had put its influence also in the Far East. The Dutch had what is today Indonesia. And then Russia was busy conquering Siberia. These European countries, oh yes, and a lot of them, Britain was conquering a lot of South Africa. A lot of these European countries dividing up Africa and the Middle East among themselves. And then the United States got involved in building its own empire, and these same countries point finger, you are ugly imperialist. Hey, well, we're doing what you've been, no, we've decided that's the wrong thing to do, we quit. And here about the time we quit, you start doing it. And for many years, the Soviet Union would accuse Americans of being just that, imperialist, and with some justification. The issue, should we have gone to war with Spain? To some extent, that is still unresolved. It is true the Filipinos were not ready for democracy. Now, I want us to jump ahead of the story a little bit. In 1942, Japan took the Philippines from us. Of course, this was an active war. We were at war with Japan at the time. We had gotten to war just a few months before. So, the Japanese drove us out of the Philippines, but by the time the war ended, we had them back. So the Filipinos can credit us with liberating them from Japan. And then on July 4th, 1946, less than a year after the war ended, we gave the Filipinos their independence. The Filipinos immediately set up a democracy like so many of those far eastern countries, including Singapore, including Indonesia, and they set up their own constitutions. Democracies failed and a dictatorship took over. Today, Philippines are run by a dictator. So is Singapore. In other words, basically, we used to discuss this when I was in high school. Would these countries ever be ready for democracy, or did democracy only work with a certain kind of people and not work for others? I had a person like, well, if it works for us, it'll work for them. The logic is bad. All right, well, we can't resolve that, but we can continue to think about it. Anyway, we really made a bad name for ourselves in the way we treated the Filipinos. All right, moving on, chapter 21. Progressivism.